My guest today is Professor Jesse J. Holland of George Washington University. Jesse's work as a reporter, author, and TV journalist has taken him everywhere from the halls of Congress and the White House to the wilds of Wakanda. Yes, that Wakanda, to the studios of C SPAN. Yes, that C SPAN. He's been a distinguished visiting scholar at the Library of Congress, and his work has been nominated for an NAACP Image Award. Jesse has reported on the most fraught issues of our times, and with the 2024 election cycle in full swing, he's well positioned to draw back the curtain on the role of journalism in an era where alternative facts and opinion hold more sway than data, evidence, and expertise. Thanks so much for talking with me today. And I'd love it if you could start by giving us a little background on what journalism was like when you first arrived in Washington and, kind of compare it to the situation facing reporters today.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. This is a extreme pleasure of mine to be able to talk to you. So, I have to admit that my career in journalism has spanned so many different parts. In fact, I am one of the few people still left in journalism who took typing in high school. I actually started on a typewriter. And I remember being so excited at the college newspaper at the University of Mississippi when they gave us our very first Macintosh, the little beige boxes, and we were
Oh,
excited because we could play Spaceward Ho on network computers for the first time. Much less put out newspapers, but we were excited that we could play video games on network computers.
that's
And
amazing.
now these things are common. Um, when I first came to Washington, D.C. in 2000, I came in at the end of the old school three martini lunch reporting style. I think I actually got one martini at one lunch before it was official notice went out that martini lunches were over. So the old Watergate style reporting was just ending when I got to Washington. So I got here, frankly, just in time and like only a year before September 11th. And then, of course, everything changed in Washington. Um, now, I start feeling like an old geezer when I talk to the current journalists and the journalism students here at George Washington. The style of reporting that I was taught when I was in journalism school at the University of Mississippi and the style of reporting that you have to do now, frankly, post pandemic, is completely different. Back when I started, face to face conversations were the only way to do it.
Hmm.
Now people talk over video conferencing software, they talk over text, they talk over email. And those were ways that we would have never conducted business when I first started. But one thing you can say about journalism is that it always changes. But as long as we hold to our core principles of telling the truth as we know it and as we can prove it, I think the medium doesn't matter as much as long as we hew to those principles of only reporting what we can prove, not just what we think or what we thought may have happened. Now, just to be clear for everybody, because I go through this with my students as well, I'm talking about reporting. I'm not talking about opinion columns. I'm not talking about commentators. I teach the old notepad and pencil. Someone said this, someone did this in this day. It's a whole nother conversation if you want to talk about the opinion side of the business. If you want to talk about the Rachel Maddows and the Sean Hannitys, I don't teach that. I teach the who, what, when, where, why, and how do you know this person said this style of journalism, which is still necessary. Most Americans, I think, enjoy opinionated articles more than they do the old style who, what, when, where, why, and how. But of course, you can't have an opinion unless somebody tells you what happened at the meeting. So the style of journalism that I'm still teaching is still 100% necessary for every other style to exist. And so I'm still teaching to this day, I'm still teaching and doing the classic no opinion journalism because no matter what else, I think our country still needs that.
Well, that's reassuring. And I also think that it ties really well into what I was going to ask you next. Because I've heard from both my colleagues here at the Union of Concerned Scientists and from reporters on National Public Radio and other outlets that many Americans aren't aware of crucial political happenings. And for example, um, one of my colleagues mentioned that the Inflation Reduction Act, it's got the largest climate investment in U.S. history. And then another is that in when journalists were interviewing people in states that were having primaries on Super Tuesday, people were asking like, "Oh, who are the Republicans and the Democrats going to run for president?" Do you have any insight about that? Are we talking like messaging problems, or is it too much competition for voters' attention, or what?
Well, one of the things that always concerns me is that we're being bombarded every day with a flood of information. I'm not even going to call it facts, information. Some true, some not true. So it's becoming harder and harder for the average American to figure out what they should be listening to. Am I going to listen to the Daily Show or am I going to listen to the 7 o'clock news? Do I watch 60 Minutes or do I watch the football game? There's so much out there. It's hard for the average consumer to say, this is the most important thing and I need to listen to it. Because, first of all, they have to find it. And we were lucky growing up where there was probably 4 basic television channels. You had ABC, NBC, CBS, and PBS. Those were the only ones you had. And you were lucky if your town had a morning paper and an evening paper. So the silos for information that went to the American people were very small. Everyone had the same information because they didn't have options to find anything else. Now you have hundreds, if not thousands, of streaming networks and streaming channels. And the internet has turned everyone with a computer into their own media service. So it's harder for people to figure out who they should listen to. So sometimes that kind of information gets missed because there are so many options. Now, I'm not advocating for there to be fewer options, but I think where we in the media passed up on a great opportunity was when the internet first became popularized. Nobody taught media literacy. No one said, here are the things that are important that you should listen to, you should read, you should get your information from. So we're still playing catch up on teaching Americans the difference between disinformation and information. And as soon as we teach one thing, a new front opens up. For example, and here's the example I normally give my students. It takes between 20 and 50 years for Americans to realize that a certain thing can possibly lie to them. So let's go back and think about Orson Welles and War of the Worlds.
Classic.
Radio was new. So people thought everything they heard on the radio had to be true. And it took a while for people to figure out that, everything on the radio doesn't have to be true. Well, along comes television. And for a while, people thought everything they heard on television had to be true. If Walter Cronkite said it, it had to be a fact. Well, eventually we figure out that there are people who can manipulate Americans through television. And we learned not to believe everything we heard. Then the internet comes along. And for a while, if you read it on Twitter, if you read it on Facebook, people thought it had to be true. So we're just now getting to the point where we're teaching Americans that everything you see on X, sorry, I said Twitter, everything you see on X, everything you see on Snapchat, it's not true. But just as we're getting Americans to believe this, AI comes along. And so now we're trying to, that's why you see such an active effort from media companies to try to explain to people, just because you see a commercial with Joe Biden and Donald Trump hugging each other doesn't mean that really happened. Just because you get a telephone call that sounds like Joe Biden telling you not to vote doesn't mean Joe Biden really called your house. So we're actively trying to report on things that are going on and trying to advance media literacy and understanding at the same time. And frankly, with the volatility, I'll just call it the volatility of the journalism industry, we don't always do both very well. But we're trying, because especially with an election coming up, we're spending a lot of time trying to educate Americans right now that every video you see with a celebrity or with a candidate or with a foreign leader, all those videos might not be true. You can't just believe it because you see it. Now, just to be clear, you and I are not AI. Let's be clear. Let's be clear.
Last I checked.
Yeah, but there's going to be a lot of stuff coming up over the next few months as we go into a presidential election that we're going to have to double check before we believe, as the song goes, our lying eyes. Because just because we see it doesn't mean that it's going to be true. And that's an area that we in the media have to do better about teaching Americans. And for me, that's the biggest change in journalism from when I came to Washington, that we actually are doing more of an educational part for non-journalists. When I first got to Washington, we just reported. Now we have to educate and report.
That is a tall order for anyone. And we're seeing that in the scientific community too. Scientists used to be a little bit more cloistered away, and now we have to do outreach. We have to communicate because of. Actually, again, we've sort of led right into what I was going to ask you. I wanted to talk a little bit about the omnipresent issue of alternative facts, and it is a phrase that makes both scientists and journalists pretty queasy. So, how have you seen journalism as a practice shift in response to this subjectification of reality?
Right. Well, as I suspect with many scientists, there was a time where we thought our work should speak for itself, that we weren't needed as people or spokespeople or advocates for our industries, because our work should speak for itself. And now we've learned and we're learning that not speaking up for your work means that the people who need to hear it are only hearing from the people who are trying to tear it down. So this is something that many of us were uncomfortable with, because the traditional journalism school says the one person you should never know what they think is the reporter, because their work should speak for themselves. The reporter's opinion has nothing to do with what they're writing. But now we have to at least speak up for our own work. And the same, I think, goes for scientists, that because if you don't speak up for it, the only person that the common American will hear is a person that says they're just lying, they're just elite, and they're not used to they're not one of the common Americans, and so they just don't believe them. And I always laugh when people try to portray journalists as not common Americans, because frankly, we don't get paid that much. So if There are so many stories I know of journalists who have to hold second jobs because they want to do journalism, because the journalism isn't paying enough. We're as common as it gets. they they see the few people who make the millions of dollars, the television personalities and the hosts of shows, and they think that that's all of us. And the same way I think goes for scientists. They see a few scientists that may have said something off color, or may have sent an email that they shouldn't have, and they paint the entire industry with that one person. But we're at the point now that everyone in their respective industries has to be willing to publicly defend their work. In the past, we would have said our work speaks for itself. Either you believe it or not. But lies spread faster than truth. So if we allow people to just lie about what we do, it is going to color how people who don't understand what we do feel about it. You can't have only one voice talking about your work. Somebody has to be willing, whether they feel like they're appropriate or not, to speak up and say, hey, I've spent years studying this. Here's what I think, and I can prove it through this information.
Well, and that's what
And so just
I wanted to
go
add.
ahead.
This is like, because scientists haven't always been media savvy, which I'm sure hasn't made reporting on science topics easy for journalists like you. So do you have any best practices that scientists can use to help journalists convey the significance and credibility of stories to the general public?
Well, I will say it as I tell my journalism students. So I can tell you what I tell my journalism students to do when they talk to experts like scientists about an issue that they are not familiar with. The tactic I tell the journalists, and by the way, this is a tactic that scientists should also put in their arsenal. I tell my students to ask experts to talk to us like children. Because most of the time when I'm talking to an expert or a scientist, they're used to talking to other experts. So they're not used to, and I hate using this phrase, but it's the honest truth, they're not used to dumbing down their conversation for someone who has no idea of what they're talking about. They're used to talking to people on their equivalent level and explaining to people who don't need the background. But in journalism, not only do I need to be able to understand what the expert is saying, I have to explain to somebody else who knows even less than I do. So what I tell my journalism students is to say something along the lines of, explain it to me as if I'm a 12-year-old. Because if I can't understand it, there's no way I'm going to be able to explain it to my readers or my viewers. And it usually makes, especially when we're talking to people who have children, that turns a switch in their head and say, oh yeah, you weren't there for the 30 years of research that made me understand this. How do I break it down to where someone else who hasn't spent as much time as I've spent on it can understand it? And usually when you say that to an expert or a scientist, they realize that they're talking at a level that only people who are experts like them will understand, but that's not who we're writing for. We're writing for everyone else. So I would say if you're having a conversation with a reporter, unless this is a reporter who has spent an equivalent amount of time reporting on this subject, understand that the reporter probably doesn't understand 2/3 of what you're saying, and be very specific, be understanding, and explain everything. I would rather have someone explain everything than to talk briefly and go back to my newsroom and say, I didn't understand any of that. Because how can I then explain it to my readers if I, as a reporter, don't understand it.
That is excellent advice. And I do that instinctually when I'm talking. Like, my expertise in volcanology is lava flow morphology. Morphology isn't a word that a lot of non scientists are familiar with. And so it's easier to say lava flow shape. Is the lava,
Right.
is it the characteristics? Is it sticky or is it oozy? And you know what? That is fundamentally what some of the words we use mean. We just have to substitute with something simpler. And that's excellent advice because, yeah, I remember hearing that most people read at, like, what is an eighth grade level in the
It,
United States.
that number changes every year.
Okay. So maybe eighth grade if we're lucky. Uh, so yeah, there's no point in trying to make it more complex. We just have to simplify and cut to the heart of it, I think.
And
So
by the way, I always hear from experts that we're oversimplifying things. But understand that for many journalists, if you're on television, you only have 3 minutes for the entire story. Or if you're writing for a magazine or a website or a newspaper, you have maybe 600 words. If you're lucky, maybe 1,200 words. So we have to simplify it to meet the standards of the medium we're working for. We understand that you've spent 30 years on this and you really want everybody to understand all of the details of how it works. And while we would love to be able to explain that to people, the medium we're working for doesn't allow it. So we need to be able to shorthand and be able to explain it the best we can. We know we're not going to explain it to your satisfaction, but we want to be able to explain it the best we can to get to your point of what you're talking about.
I think that's it's good to think of journalists as not being like obstructionist. They're facilitators of getting the information out, and they are ideally objective facilitators. And I think that's a good takeaway for scientists to have. A lot of times, scientists look at the media very skeptically, so it's nice to say this. Try thinking about it this way. So about stories and stories that include science, what have you seen that, especially recently, that seems to resonate with the non-scientist public, and if specifically if you've got any insight into communities of color and lower income people, because they're historically ignored by often the media and scientists. So what sort of resonates with people these days?
Well, I mean, I will say, and you keep hearing me come back to what I'm telling my students because I'm talking about these things with future journalists right now. When you're talking about telling stories, you keep in mind that journalism is literally storytelling. So we're not stenographers. We're not going to write down every single word someone says and regurgitate every single word back to our readers, our viewers, our listeners. What we're looking for is we're looking for those gripping stories, those tales, those anecdotes that will stand out and make someone want to continue to read, watch, or listen. Many times in journalism, especially when we start out, we're trying too much to be informative and not enough to be entertaining. Because it doesn't matter how much information I put in my story if no one will read it. So I'm always pushing for my students to realize that we're not just informing the public, we're also trying to entertain them as well. One of the examples, and I came up with this theory while I was covering the Supreme Court, was the spinach filled ho ho. Now, for your audience, some people may know, and some people may not know. A ho ho was a little chocolate cake with filling on the inside of it. And my theory was when I was covering the Supreme Court that the Supreme Court wasn't very entertaining.
Gee.
Nobody likes to sit and read dense stories about with Latin terms and information that really doesn't apply to everyone all the time. But I could get them to eat the spinach, which was the actual law that was going on, by surrounding it with chocolate with entertaining stories. So I would try to find something in every Supreme Court case that was a interesting story or an anecdote about how this case got here, or here's what could happen if they rule this way versus that way. So I could get you to read what I wanted you to read, which was the legal part, by surrounding it with goodies.
The storytelling.
The same thing goes for science stories. The same thing goes for sports stories. The same thing goes for congressional stories. We have to learn to find the good story in what we're doing and surround it. And on the inside, put what we need people to know. So if you're a scientist or you're an expert that needs to talk about something that may be dense, maybe a little complicated, I promise you, if there's something entertaining about that thing you can say, something that's fascinating, something that's surprising that you can say, if you hand that anecdote to a reporter, I guarantee you it'll make the reporter more likely to write about the thing you really want them to know later on in the story. Because once again, it doesn't matter how important the information is. It doesn't matter how crucial the discovery is if no one will read it, if no one will watch the piece, if no one will listen to it on the radio. We have to give people things they want to hear and suck them into eating the spinach by putting the ho-ho around it.
I mean, I've told people, yeah, you gotta make people eat their vegetables if they want dessert. But I that image is so disturbing, but also effective. And now I will never look at a ho ho the same way. Thank you so much, Jesse. Um, so, on with thinking about gross foodstuffs, we'll move into media and legacy media in particular, which these days is probably like eating a spinach-filled ho ho, because things are changing. Newspapers are in some places dying off, and cable news isn't what it used to be. But you and I are close enough in age where we're on Facebook and Instagram and what used to be Twitter, now X. So you've seen a lot of this shift. So can you sort of crystal ball for a moment and give us a glimpse of what the future might look like for journalism and how regular people are accessing and engaging with really critical news stories?
Well, the one thing I can say for sure is that whatever I say right now will be proven to be completely false, maybe 5 or 10 years down the road, because journalism is so volatile. The thing I can say, and I say repeatedly here as I teach at the School of Media and Public Affairs, is that journalism will always exist. There will always be the need for someone to represent people at things that the people can't get to. There will always be the need for it. The medium will change. Just as in our lifetime, it's changed from print and newspapers and magazines to pretty much all online organizations. Television is about to change with the creation of AI television hosts.
Uh.
If you want to really be impressed, go watch Channel One. Channel One is a new network that has all AI newsreaders. They don't have any human beings on screen. AI has gotten to the point where they can put an AI host and someone write the script, and the AI reads it just like a 5 o'clock news host would.
Wow.
So
That's
we know
terrifying
it,
and exciting in some ways, but definitely very scary.
well, this is what I'm saying. The industry is changing so quickly that any guess that I would give you would be probably proven false in just like maybe not even 5 years, maybe even 2 years. But one of the things that I see coming down the pike specifically is more individualized news. Just like today, we all choose our own entertainment. We don't just watch ABC, CBS, NBC, PBS. We now have all of these different streaming networks where we can choose what type of entertainment that we want to watch. Also, we all watch them on our own individual screens instead of sitting around a television with the family. One person's watching their phone, one person's watching their iPad, one person's watching the television set. No one's watching the same thing anymore. News is going that way, where we're going to all sooner or later be able to choose the individualized news that we want to consume. And we're getting there now, by the way. But I suspect somewhere in the future, there's going to be individualized news where I can read today about the Supreme Court, and tomorrow I can read about the Carolina Panthers, and the next week I can read about the weather, because those are the subjects I tell my news provider, these are the things I want to read about. So for years, have been able to have a nationwide conversation where everyone knows what everyone else knows. Those days are gone. And I think they're going away even faster as we try to figure out how to provide this personalized news that will keep people coming to us. In the past, people accepted the news that was given to them because they had no choice. There were no options. Now, just like we have options between cable, satellite, and streaming, in the future, I suspect you're going to have the options of, here's the topics I want to read about, and those are the only topics you're going to see provided by your news services. So I think it's going to become more personalized. And just to be honest, I don't think this is a good thing, because I think we need to, as a country, all have a common base of information we're working from. But I think this, once again, this is something that makes me one of those old fogies. I'm saying, here's how it used to be. And I think it was better in the past. We're going to have to now find our way in this future that we frankly don't know how we're going to deal with yet.
What that reminds me of is there's a quote. It's quite a bit longer, but the gist of it is, it's by Robert Heinlein, the sci-fi author. And the bit I'm thinking of is, he says, specialization is for insects, and also for PhDs. So don't get me wrong. There is a time and a place for specialization, but I think news consumption is an area where we all benefit if we have more of a buffet in front of us. So at least we can kind of get an idea that there are vegetables as well as dessert,
as well as those ho-hos, right?
Yes. And so then again, back to this election cycle. What are, from your journalistic instincts here, what are the key storylines that you think we're going to see around the environment, climate, and technology?
Well, given the two presumptive candidates that we have, President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump, I think, of course, we're going to hear a lot about, from the Republican side, this whole Green New Deal tactic that they've been using, claiming that attempts to better the environment are detrimental to business. Mm-hmm. On the Democratic side, there's always a question of how much they're going to actually talk about the fact that under the current president, we now pump more oil than we have under previous administrations. Of course, the Democrats think they have the environmentalists, they're on the environmentalist side, but the fact is that we're actually pumping more oil now than we ever did before. And we'll hear a lot of conversation back and forth about the preservation of federal land. We'll hear a lot of talk about land rights, because that's a huge deal in the West, about who owns what land and what can you do with the land that you own. I don't know whether these will be the main conversations during this presidential election. I think it's going to actually circle around the economy and age, because we will have two of the oldest presidential candidates in history running against each other, and everyone is concerned, especially when it comes to presidential politics. It's the economy, stupid. People want to know, Is there hope for our lives to be better in the future? That's what that those I think unless something changes, those will be the main topics of the presidential election. But these environmental issues, fracking, the whether who we are selling our oil to and who we are importing our oil from, climate change. I mean, while there are still some people who don't believe that our climate is changing, um, the wildfires, the hurricanes, the weather, I think, is making a pretty good case for there being actual climate change and us as human beings actually needing to do something about it. Those conversations will come up because you're also most likely this year going to have the largest number of young voters voting in an election. And those are the things that these young voters are concerned about. They want to know what kind of not only what kind of economy are we leaving them, what kind of world will they have to live in? And that's where these issues of sustainability, climate change, and environment come in.
That's kind of what my inclination was. So it's nice to hear that I think I'm on track with that in my own perception of how things are going. And then I have a couple more serious questions, but I did want to wildly switch, and I teased Wakanda in the introduction I gave you. So I think now is a great time to mention that you've authored not just great historical nonfiction, like your books The Invisibles, The Untold Story of African American Slaves in the White House, and Black Men Built the Capitol, Discovering African American History in and around Washington, D.C. People should get those books. They're great. But you have also authored Who is the Black Panther, about everyone's favorite cat slash king and Avenger, as well as a Star Wars book, for good measure, right? So how has balancing your serious journalism with your love of a good space opera or comic series, how has that helped you professionally? And obviously, I'm, of course, thinking about this in terms of my fellow scientists, because a lot of us wrestle with finding a balance.
Well, one of the things I can say is that for years, I thought that you couldn't do both. You couldn't write seriously about politics and then write about a cat king from Africa. Uh, that there was some kind of there was some kind of a barrier between being able to do them both, and it took it took some very intelligent professors at my graduate degree program to say it's all writing. um, there is nothing that's stopping you from being able to write about whatever you want to write about. All it requires is a passion for the thing. And I've been a comic book fan my entire life. I started reading comic books when I was like 5 or 6 years old. My dad would bring them to me. He bought me Avengers and Fantastic Four and the Incredible Hulk. So it's something that's been part of my life forever. And while I still enjoy the journalism and talking about politics and interviewing people from around the country about what they think about the latest Supreme Court ruling, I am able to actually be part of the thing that I'm also passionate about by writing stories about the Black Panther. In January, I'll have a Captain America book coming out, which is really exciting. I've been able to write Superman for DC Comics. So these are things that I really enjoy, and I will tell everyone, especially those of you who are scientists, being a scientist does not mean you can't be a novelist. Being a scientist doesn't mean you can't write about martial arts, or it doesn't mean you can't write about politics. All it takes is the passion for the thing. And I think we do a lot of people a disservice. And it's something I talk about now a lot at a university, that many of us are doing the thing we decided we wanted to do when we were 15, 16 years old. But that doesn't mean we have to do that thing for the rest of our lives. our tastes change. We may now prefer to do something else. I deal with a lot of people who started out as one thing and became something else when their lives changed. So just because, don't ever feel like just because you're a scientist, you can't be a teacher, or just because you're a scientist, you can't be a podcaster, or a novelist, or a comic book writer, or a doctor, or a nurse, or a race car driver. All it takes is the passion for the thing. I am lucky enough that I come from a family of teachers, and I said to myself when I was 15 years old, I would never be a teacher. Well, 20 years later, what am I doing but teaching? So just because you set your life on a certain path as a teenager doesn't mean that something else can't attract you as an adult. And you can do that thing. Writing comic books literature is how I frankly relax. It just so happens that I'm not writing for myself anymore. I'm not just scribbling fan fiction for myself. I get to let other people read it. And I say that to everyone. Whatever your passion is should be part of your life. If your passion is science, great if you're working as a scientist. But if your passion is writing and you're a scientist, there's nothing stopping you from doing that. If your passion is driving go-karts, go drive go-karts. But you have to the worst things that can happen to you at the end of your life is you saying, I wish I had.
Yeah.
So whatever your I wish I had will be, you should be doing it now. I'm not saying quit your job. I'm saying find time in your life for whatever you think you'll regret later on.
Yeah. I think that's excellent advice. And so good. I got to ask you about Black Panther and comics, so I'm happy. So all right. So okay, back to the journalism and science. What role do you think journalism today has in making science accessible and understandable for everyday people?
I mean, I frankly think that's one of our jobs as journalists, to bring to people ideas and things that they would not have known otherwise. Um, One of the things that I appreciate the most is journalistic organizations that still have science sections, that still have health sections, where you can go read about the things that you yourself would never have known if somebody hadn't come along and tried to explain it to you. Um, I used to be a huge advocate of science magazines, but unfortunately, they're dying out very, very quickly. And hopefully, someone will come along that will figure out how we can get this information back out to the American people. But once again, in the past, we would have those type of stories show up in Time Magazine or in Newsweek or National Geographic, which most of those magazines, if not dead, are dying. So we don't have that same base of information that we can talk about those things. That's literally what we're supposed to do in journalism. We're supposed to find those interesting things that are going on in science, find those interesting things that are going on in health and technology, and bring it to the American people so we can talk about it and see where we're going and have a conversation before we get there.
Yeah.
The loss of this conversation is what we see happening when we're making these huge leaps and the American people find out about it after it's already happened. In the past, we would hear it as it was coming. I mean, some of it we were. I'm correcting myself because I'm immediately thinking about Oppenheimer. It's like, well, that was a big leap that we didn't know about until it happened. But we can have some of these conversations in advance. And that's what journalism is supposed to do, is to bring that kind of information to the American people so we can have these conversations. We don't always do a great job of it. There needs to be more science journalism. There need to be more climate journalism. There need to be more technology journalism out there. But We need to find a way to have this conversation between the experts and the American people, so we all can be comfortable with where we're going and know why we're going there.
Yeah, that's brilliant. So, all right. So then I kind of have a final question that I like to ask people when they come on this program, because we are the Union of Concerned Scientists. So, Jesse, why are you concerned?
Wow. Okay. I am always concerned about what world I and other people are leaving behind for the future. I have a 17-year-old daughter and a 15-year-old son. So I spend way too many hours wondering about what the world will look like when they leave the nest, when they've finished college and they're ready to go out into the world. What have we left behind? What should we be doing now to make the world better for future generations? um, I've always been concerned about journalism in this standpoint, because we're basically watchers, not doers. We're watching what other people are doing, and we're telling people about what other people are doing. But what is it we're actually doing ourselves to make the world better? And I think you see a lot. This is one other reason why you see a lot more journalistic organization pushing media literacy, because it's something we can do to make the world better. Um, I spend way too much time thinking about whether all of us are doing enough to not only make our lives better, but the lives of people who come after us. I am lucky enough that my parents live on land that my family's been on for 5 generations, basically since the end of the Civil War. So I can see how the world has changed for my family by looking at the old chimney where my great great grandfather had his first store on this land. And I'm wondering, when I have a great 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 grandson or granddaughter, will they be able to say, here's something that my great great grandfather did that helped us and the world in the future? I think we really need to think more about what we're leaving behind more than what we have. So that's what I spend way too much time thinking about these days.
So, I didn't tell you it was a two-parter. So the
Oh, two-parter.
second half is, what are you doing about that concern?
Well, this is one of the reasons why I do as much writing as I can, because one of the things that always concerns me is the number of stories and knowledge that is being lost every day through the death of our elders. This is one reason why I started writing nonfiction, because when I moved to Washington, in the midst of covering all of the politics I was covering, I was hearing all of these stories about contributions of African Americans to the Capitol and to the White House, but they were only being shared verbally. They were only being shared orally. And the problem, oral storytelling is great, but the problem with oral storytelling is that the story dies when the storyteller dies. So I wanted to take these stories and make them permanent by writing them down. This is why I still do nonfiction. I love doing my fiction, my Captain America, my Superman, my Black Panther. But this is why I will never give up the nonfiction, because there are other stories out there that I want to tell before they are lost. Because, of course, you're doomed to repeat history if you don't remember it. So I will always stick with nonfiction writing, because there are things I want to write about now, so we future generations don't make the same mistakes, so they know that this has happened, and so here's what happened. Now we don't have to make the same mistake. So I consider my journalism and my nonfiction writing my way of making the world better, by recording the stories that happened, so the world knows this is what happened then, we shouldn't make the same mistake. So I'm hoping rather vainly that my writing will be my contribution to the world and to future generations.
Thank you so much, Jesse Holland, for talking with me today. It has been an absolute privilege and a blast.
Thank you so much. I always enjoy having conversations with you. And please invite me back at any time.
Will do.